Thanks for having us, guys. Just a heads up, I speak very quickly. If you need me to slow down, just let me know. Okay, so here we go. I have been designing games for several years, and I've written several things about games and game design over the last couple of years. I've been teaching games and interactive media for more than 12 years, and I've actually worked at a variety of universities as a professor, and I'm about to move over to the University of Miami to be a Knight Chair. I've designed and developed scores of independent games over the years and won some awards for that work. And I also speak with the press to encourage the effective use of games to solve all kinds of challenges in the world. As of late, I've been arguing for the value of games in specific contexts. I am the founding director of the American University Game Lab and Studio, and our focus is applying game design in non-game contexts. As of late, we've acquired more than $800,000 worth of grants and contracts and funding since 2014 from partners and funders listed here. So we've done work for them either as collaborators or as clients. One of our projects is JoLT, which stands for the Journalism Leadership and Transformation. Thanks to a generous support from the Knight Foundation, we aimed to help journalism through game design. Together, myself, Dean Jeff Rutenbeck, and the chair of journalism, Amy Eisman, we created a kind of crack team of student fellows shown here. We also worked with some wonderful professional fellows, including Bob Hone, who will speak in a few minutes about some of the actual findings. One of the things we did was we actually interviewed and collaborated with a variety of news organizations to try and understand some of the typical challenges that news and journalism are facing these days. And we created a variety of new games. The game I'm here to talk about is Factitious, which is obviously why we're here. So Factitious is a fake news game that's designed to meet two needs, both media literacy and audience polling. It was actually featured on NPR, Newsweek, and several other venues. And the whole sort of really interesting thing about it is very quickly we got more than 1.6 million articles played, and that was in 3 days, from July 3rd to July 6th. To give you some context for how this design came about, I'd like to give you a very quick history. So the original concept came from Bob Hone, who's here, and Maggie Farley, who actually presented last year at Games for Change. And they did a lot of good work in drafting a system for the game and doing some paper prototypes around it. And their original design looked much like this. The whole concept was to try and emphasize and help people understand the difference between advertising, opinion, fake, and true news. So these are the sort of result cards you'd get if you had guessed correctly or incorrectly. And then what we did after that original design is we actually went ahead and iterated. We really do believe in iterative design, and so the folks that you see here, Amy Eisman, Maggie Farley, Kelly Dunlap, Sherry Statu, Joyce Rice, and myself, all contributed to a new design. And our focus in that new design was explicitly about new mechanics, new graphics, and improved data reporting. So we came up with a concept that's very similar to Tinder for news. That's how we described it. And so this is the new version of Factitious that was released last year. And in short, players are presented with an article and asked to swipe left if it's fake news or right if it's real news. So if they want a hint, they can also ask for a hint, and they'll see the source. And then they either get a correct message, which tells them about some of the context for the article, or they get an incorrect message, which helps them understand what they should be looking for. Obviously, this assists in media literacy. One of the things we did was we tried to move it a little further towards what we call human computation games. So if you're unfamiliar with human computation games, they're basically designed to turn play into computation, sensing, or knowledge. One of the best examples of that is a game called Fold It that many of you have probably heard of. And if you're less familiar with human computation games, you may not know PhotoCity, which was designed to help build 3D models of an environment. Or you may not know the ESP game, which is sort of the quintessential original human computation game, which actually helps inform image tagging for algorithms like Google's search algorithm. So we thought, hey, let's really capitalize on this idea of having a large-scale game, a game lots of people can play, and use it as a polling and feedback tool. So each play is actually an eye on an article detecting how or what is perceived as fake news. And what made this possible was the original sort of design, which had this sort of database in the back end and was collecting data on users that we can aggregate, report on, and analyze. So just as a preview, before we transition over to the latest findings, we had more than 450,000 players, distinct players, because we were trapping this by session. And we also had more than 285,000 people who played at least 15 articles, which is nice. We get all that review on those articles. We also had 47,000 who played more than 15 articles. That's basically coming back to the game and trying for new content. The next question from my perspective was obviously, who are they? And so very simply, as a preview, so you understand what we know, we got 45,000 bits, or 45,000 people provided demographic data. So for example, we can tell that 22,000 self-identified as male, 21,000 self-identified as female, and another 1,200 self-identified as other. We also know the number of participants per age group, so you can kind of see how that dispersed out. Of course, this is self-report data. And we also understand highest level of education. As you can see from the blue here, largely bachelor's degree players. One of the good pieces of news is that we actually got, when people came back to play, we got a 13-point increase. So people went from the 70s to the 80s after playing, which is really interesting when you think about the fact that they're seeing some of the same articles. You'd expect a higher rate of performance. But the good news is people got better. So I'm going to switch over now to Bob, who's going to give you some more specifics about the data that we found. Thanks.
So this game is still live. That's the URL. We're going to be tracking, and we see if you guys score better than the average person or not. I'm going to talk about the traffic data, sort of how we, how much we've gotten in a little bit more detail than Lindsay had provided. We get some hints about possible classroom use, and I'll give you some indication why we think that. Talk a little bit about how do we determine if these articles were engaging? Were they too easy or too hard? And there's a system we use for that. Talk about our educational goals. Lindsay already sort of hinted at that with the source. We actually can measure the benefit of looking at that button, and we actually have some surprising results from that, which is we actually can see false positive and false negatives. People view a hint and do worse. And then next steps. Lindsay already covered the other folks. I think the other one to add is a friend of mine, Chaz Brown. He's called Wizard because we had gotten a large grant from the NIH, and Nintendo cut us off from the Wii, so we built our own Wii Motion Plus. A small little inertial tracking device with wireless Bluetooth. So he and an engineer and a half did that in 5 months. So he's this side of brilliant. So here is the actual data from July. So we got a notice on the NPR website. It wasn't even an NPR radio story, it's just on there, and it bounced around. And so you see sort of these things, and it trails off pretty fast. This is what the year looks like, right? So it drops down, goes to August, but it comes back up in September. And that's not a typical type of pattern for online stuff unless you got any kind of other buzz going on. If you aggregate it, there's more gameplays that have happened from September to May, which again is very atypical for stuff online. If you look at just those months, there's a pattern there. What starts up in September and January? Classrooms, right? So we have done no research to actually reach out to teachers. We have no way to sort of doing that yet. We're thinking about changing that. Also looked at sort of the weekly patterns. So this is July, and you can sort of see there's actually a bit of activity on the weekends. And in the school year, there's nothing on the weekends, and there's a lot during the week. And if you plot that as a line graph, you sort of see kind of a clear. So we think that's pretty clear, right? So one of the things we're going to do is take a look and say, okay, how could we do that? And I'll talk a little bit later when we talk about next steps. Empirical difficulty doing. So 2 years ago, Lindsay and I were here talking about, I was talking about a game where this was basically for kids with severe anxiety, and we're trying to train them to look away from angry faces. So here are the angry faces, and we're hiding numbers. So the question is, are those numbers too well hidden or not hidden well enough? And as the puzzle designer, you can't test. You know too much. So we basically would run tests of these, and so we would then look and say, okay, for each number was the success rate, how many people found it? So if it was below a certain level, we basically go, we have to bring that up. We had a whole tool for adjusting the visibility of a number. And I'll talk a little bit about the system. So if everybody got it, then it was too easy to find, and we would then do this a couple rounds before we ever then tested with kids with severe anxiety, and then it's actually in a clinical trial, which I just checked with them, it's about 1/3 done. So it's unfortunately another 2 years before if it actually helps. So the system that I actually developed with Chaz, my friend, at my former company, is that we run a particular way of running it through it. So in terms of factitious testing, what would be the measure? It'd still be success rate. So we'd run the articles in, and you don't need to run too many people to get some of these metrics. 15 people is going to give you an idea. And too easy is a very high success rate. Everybody gets it, then it's not engaging, and that's not challenging. In the same way, if it's too low, then it's too hard. So the system is basically 3 parts. You have a designer dashboard. In this case, it's got a database of all our articles. We can pick which articles we run in a test by just listing them in a list of numbers. All the articles are tagged with a number, and that's it. I could change it right now. You would run it, and it would be different. So it's pulled in at runtime. The game testbed runs, and then the data reviewer, Lindsay showed a bit of it, and basically that allows us to very quickly see, I mean really quickly see, that particular test, and we would do very quick iterations. We'd do it with a class, we would change it, we would do it. So it's a very, very flexible and powerful system. So this is the actual results for all the articles that were released, all right? 45 articles, and 15 of those are picked at random. And so arbitrarily, 90 and 40, there's nothing magical. That's just pick a number out of the air. So above 90, we think that's too easy, and below 40, we think that's too hard. And generally, we hit that, right? That's not a mistake. Those were tuned, right? Our first versions don't look like that. So now let's switch over to educational goals. We want to get people to think about where the information comes from. There are other things you can do, like are there a named source, right? There's other types of cues. I have a middle career as a PBS science television producer, and so I was a journalist for 7 years. It's been a long time ago. But I was trained as a journalist. And so there are other ways of doing it, but the sources we thought was going to be a key one. And so again, you have the show source button, you click on it, and you see, oh, Time. That's a reputable firm. That probably means it's accurate. Because we're tracking things so carefully, we can actually look at, if you clicked on a hint, what was your success rate versus somebody who did not click on a hint? And we're working with 8 million article plays. Many hundreds of thousands of players. So this is really big data. So there's about a 13-point increase and a p-value to die for, right? I mean, when you have that much data, you're going to be able to see patterns in what you're doing. But digging into this, there was several other messages that we didn't find out until we sort of dug into it. This is for all the articles. What is it for each article? So this one was very helpful. This is a absolute change so for example, you went from a 20% success rate to a 60%, right? There are 6 where they got worse. Compared to somebody who didn't get the hint, they did worse. So what the heck's going on there? Those numbers are the ID numbers for the articles. So this is where Maggie and I have been tag teaming this for 2.5 years. So she would then dig up and go, okay, what's going on with that article? So this is a true story. But people would look at that, and they look at the source, and it's Mashable.com. How many people here know Mashable? Okay, pretty decent site, right? You know, I say it's kind of like between Vox and HuffPost, right? So there's a little bit more clickbait, but it's certainly a reputable site. Our suspicion is that it's unfamiliar to a large portion of the audience, and in these times, unfamiliar is untrustworthy, right? Now, we have these. These are sort of known things, so we can use these to sort of see how other things are doing. Let's look at another one. This is now story number 137. This is a fake story. And what kind of link is it? FloridaSunPost.com. Sounds like a newspaper? Total bullshit. Totally made up. It's a spoof, right? And so this wasn't as bad. It went negative, but it's amazing to us that you would get that. So this is a piece of information. One is, if we were to do a new version of this game, we would have to give people more than just source. That's not a very useful piece of information, because people the people who do fake news are onto that, right? So now we have to arm people with more information. But again, we'll test that and sort of figure it out. So out of 45 articles, 6 of those were sort of either false positive or false negatives. We may keep those in, right? Because they're a learning moment for people. Mashable, not so much, but in terms of people, in terms of you're getting spoofed, absolutely, right? So on to next steps. So this is something that we've been working on for a little while, not too long, a couple weeks. We have a system that allows us to collect articles. We have a way of testing those articles, and we have a way of releasing them. And so we're going to do the Factitious Election Edition. We will be releasing a new set of articles every Monday from October 1st to the election. And we will be reporting back on what is happening. There are other features that may get into that I can't talk about because it involves funding, but this is doable with our current system. We need to get people to sort of collect the articles. I wasn't that involved. I was doing the system stuff, but I'm a journalist, or former journalist. So I will help Maggie. We'll have some other people get involved, but we will basically release this, once a week, and we see what happens. The other is that we have an idea that there's a classroom edition. So if you were designing this, and my company, Red Hill Studios, did a lot of work for Pearson and other folks who are familiar with instructional design. So one of the things that they might want is maybe 10 articles, so 30 articles in 3 rounds rather than 5. It's a captive audience. It's a classroom, right? You're not having to worry about when somebody's waiting for the bus and they're half paying attention to what's going on. Currently, they're randomized, but a teacher would certainly want to know what the order of the articles are. In fact, there's also a manual to allow somebody to use our system to customize something themselves. Now, that's a separate piece of software because then you got to build a front end for that and all the rest of it. So I'm not promising that today. We could build it. We built I was a designer of a game with a moddable PBS game, and kids designed it, uploaded 10,000 game levels to PBS Kids. So you can do it, just take some work. And then also, again, this is a stretch, is group it by content, right? So I want to do politics. I would do economics, right? So this is still the same core system. So when this isn't the first time Chaz and I have done this kind of system. We did it a couple different times. We did it in the NIH. So when you build that core system, it allows this sort of extensions. So that's it. This is who I am. There's my email address. And welcome any comments, feedback, suggestions, etc. Questions?
Great. We'll take that question in the back first, please. So the question, for those who couldn't hear, and just so it's clear, is essentially, do we have a sense for whether or not people are reading the whole article or portions of the article?
Hang on. I got a whole bunch of mess of things. So I want to make sure I don't pull up the wrong email. Hint summary. We see that in general, people who are incorrect answer more quickly.
While he's pulling that up, one of the anecdotes that was interesting is when we talked to, just anecdotally, when we talked to journalists, they would take minutes to hours to complete the game in comparison to the average person. They were actually going to websites, checking the sources of the articles. They were extraordinarily thorough, though probably not that playful. While he's pulling that up, we can take another question, because we only have a minute left. Yes? We would do fact checking on our own. So we had to pull one. We had one where we cited the Guardian, and the Guardian was wrong. And somebody called us on it. And my first reaction was, oh, it's the Guardian. But then I actually tracked back, and it was an urban myth. So a large part of what is there for the taking are urban myths. And they're going to be urban myths on both sides. Did that answer your question? Yes. Oh.
No, at this point, it's 2 journalists. So it's Maggie Farley. I was a science television producer. I have 2 degrees in engineering from MIT. So I have a certain ability to dig into that. I think if we were to get to a level where we're going to try and be like a PolitiFact, then yes, we would need to get to that.
There's a question here.
About the ground truth, would it be possible that, for instance, big numbers that you let people get ground truth themselves? So a game would, that's an interesting way. Could general opinion converge to ground truth by using the game? I mean, that would be an interesting next step, and making that also effective.
I've got some side, very simple, basically prototypes that do some of this, but we're far from getting very far in that, and there are risks in that design as well. I think we're out of time and over a little bit, but if you have something you can show really quickly.
Very quickly. So this is basically looking at everybody in terms of how quickly they respond to an article. Oh, I got to switch over. To get over there. My computer's being, I have to be on the right program to be able to do that. Sorry. I have an older computer. There we go. Okay, so this is for Article 7, right? So this is just one article. And this is now looking across and the success rate average. So the gray line is incorrect. And so you tend to see more proportion. This is normalized. So this is percent of responses, right? And so you tend to see more incorrect early. And there's a nice little bubble out here of correct. I don't think we've asked all the questions we can ask of this database. We haven't correlated any of these results with the demographics. Now, the demographics are only 10%, and they're also self-reported. Since I do health psychology stuff, it's always a question. So when you say ground truth, I want to actually do a ground truth study with 30 people who actually know that stuff, right? Before we report any of those cross correlations, because there's going to be all kinds of correlations that aren't causations. So I would be careful about that. But.
So thank you. I think, we'll be around the conference if you have other questions, or feel free to email us.